Good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN, and I'm honored to welcome you to the last event of our extraordinary pandemic season, a deep conversation between Dax-Devlon Ross and Dr. Marcus Campbell. Thanks for taking the time to attend. FAN is a nonprofit organization that presents a high-quality speaker series offered free to the public on a wide variety of topics, including human development, mental health, education, and social justice, among others. We have over 125 videos of past events archived on our website and our YouTube channel, so please be sure to explore. And now for formal introductions. Dax-Devlon Ross has had a career as an educator, nonprofit executive, equity consultant, and journalist with a focus on social justice. For over a decade, his consulting practice, Dax-Dev, has focused on developing disruptive strategies to generate equity in workplaces and education spaces alike. After receiving his JD from the George Washington University, he joined New York City Teaching Fellows, where he taught in middle and high schools in Brooklyn and Manhattan. He later helped lead the National Training and Replication Team at the Posse Foundation, one of the country's foremost college access organizations. During his tenure at Bank Street College of Education, he managed the school's partnership with the Corporation for National and Community Service. As the founding executive director of After School All-Stars New York and New Jersey, Mr. Ross built a team of 60 full and part-time program development and operations staff, serving more than 1,500 students across 2 states. He is the author of multiple books, and his journalism has been featured in Time, the New York Times, the Virginia Quarterly Review, and other national publications. He was the winner of the National Association of Black Journalists Investigative Reporting Award for his coverage of jury exclusion in North Carolina courts. He is currently an investigative reporting fellow at Type Media Center, an alumnus of Coro Leadership New York, and a member of Nation Swell Council. Dr. Marcus Campbell has served as the assistant superintendent and principal at Evanston Township High School since 2013. In this role, he serves as the educational leader and chief administrator of all school operations at ETHS and is responsible for implementing and managing the policies, regulations, and procedures of the Board of Education to ensure that all students are educated and supported in a safe, equitable, culturally relevant, and student-centered learning environment. Dr. Campbell is also a proud member of FAN's Board of Directors. And now, with no further ado, let's welcome Dax-Devlon Ross and Dr. Marcus Campbell.
Thank you, Lonnie. Good evening, Dax. How are you?
I'm great, man. It's so great to be here with you. Thank you for that warm introduction. I'm excited to get into it.
Yeah, I'm excited to get into it too. And I'll start by sharing a little bit of what we were just talking about before our program started tonight. And that is today, Joe Biden made Juneteenth a federal holiday. What are your thoughts about that?
You know, I think it's important to just at least acknowledge the importance of the moment. Obviously, it's a long time coming. And given the fraught nature of our politics and our inability to agree on many, many things right now, it's actually nice to see that this wasn't so difficult, at least. I will say, though, that I hope that we think about this day as a day of reflection and learning. I'm reading on Juneteenth right now myself, and one of the profound sort of awakenings that I'm having to it.
Got it right here.
That's an important book. And just a recognition of the amount of the reason we have a Juneteenth is because there was resistance, because you had slaveholders who just did not want to let it in, for whom the value of this, these bodies that they had defined as commodities was so important that they couldn't acknowledge that the law of the land had changed. And so I just think that it's also a reminder of resistance as a plague on our country when it comes to dealing with these issues around race and around identity more broadly. So long story, it's a long-winded way of saying I'm excited, I'm happy, it's important, symbolic. We still got other work to do on reparations and that. So I hope people don't think like, all right, they got Juneteenth now, so we can stop the conversations. I hope this is not an either or conversation here.
It's not either or conversation. That's right. It's definitely a both and conversation. And I was just reflecting on the fact that I guess back in 1983, Ronald Reagan made MLK a national holiday. So it's been what, 38 years to some extent,
That's right.
since we have been able to have some federal recognition of some aspect of race and in this country. So that's a story in and of itself.
Right. You know, it makes me think of, I remember years ago, I was up late, it was right before Martin Luther King holiday. It was like 2007, 2008. And Dr. Cornel West was on, I don't know, he was on PBS, something like that. And he talked about what he called the Santa Clausification of Dr. King. And I just always thought that was such an appropriate way in which to describe what's happened and how we think about his legacy. And of course, I think the more complex, in some ways, more important aspects of his legacy have been recovered in more recent years. You know, the FBI Files film, I think, is really important if people haven't had a chance to see it, just the way in which the FBI's obsession with his personal life. But I just think I use that because we don't want to do that, the Santa Clausification of Juneteenth either. You know, like, let's not turn it into something that it is not, and let's not flatten it to make it just another sort of opportunity to have a barbecue, which is important, and I hope people do, you know, obviously, but to do some reflection and some learning as well at all times.
Yeah. So you start the book reflecting on, well, the book has come out of a letter that you wrote in response as a reaction to George Floyd's murder. Yeah. But I want to ask this question a little differently than it initially came to me, and I guess I want to ask it as, when you first saw the video, I assume you saw the video, what was your initial response when you saw his murder?
I just thought of Alton Sterling running. You know, I thought of Freddie Gray. I thought of just the collection of people's lives have been snuffed out in front of us, and the pornographic nature of this stuff now. It's almost like it's void. And I never am one who likes the repetitive, sort of the repeating of this sort of thing, because I think it numbs us. I think it does something really disturbing and distorting to us to see something happen again and again and again. I can only say that without sounding like a cliche, just the agony, you know, but just not having any sense that it would actually would do what it did. Like, just not having any sense that it would be different, you know, just not having any sense that would be different. Yeah.
Yeah, you talk about at least 2 times I can recall in the book where you were arrested, and later in the book you talk about your own experience being beaten by the police, and it had a profound impact on you and your roommate. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, appreciate you asking about it. You know, it's not something you talk about all the time, and I'm always very thoughtful about how I use my experiences, because I always tell people, I'm not asking for your pity. I do not need that. I share this because this is something that happened, and that's a learning opportunity that can come out of that. I mean, I think for me, it was, you know, this stark juxtaposition, and I write about in the book. I had just gotten back from what can be considered the American rite of passage, which is going to Europe and backpacking around the countries. And so I had experienced what, you know, can be defined as like a sort of liberation experience abroad, a freedom experience. I don't know about liberation, a freedom experience. I don't use liberation, that's probably not the right word for it. And I was entering my last year of law school. So many things for me were on the horizon. And this was literally the Friday before school began. And it happens in such quick succession from a point of contact. And I genuinely remember being told to get on my knees, and I hadn't done anything. And I was like, I'm not, you know, I got 2 years of law school under my belt. You know, you can just tell me to get on my knees. I learned some things in criminal procedure, in criminal law, but that didn't matter in that moment. As a matter of fact, it actually was even worse than I had the temerity to think that somebody was supposed to listen to me or supposed to respond in some in like fashion, because I had an expression of my rights. And all I can say is, in a split second, I was in an alley. And I was in an alley getting beaten. And then I remember, it's just like these kinds of things, the memories are flashes. Like, there's not it's not like it's a thing where you can kind of remember all of the beats. You just remember, I remember being in an alley and I remember looking up and I remember this baton swinging. And then I remember being dragged and taken and thrown into the backseat of this police car, like, you know, like I said, like a bag of clothes bound for Goodwill. And I remember sitting there and looking and seeing my roommate, and he was just moving. It was like slow motion. There was just all surrounding batons, and he wouldn't go down. He wouldn't fight back, but he wouldn't go down. And then just remembering, like, there were so many strategic things that were done once we got into the jail. And once they found out that we were law students, they didn't want us to get to the hospital when because the bruises were so bad, they said they kept us longer than they kept anybody else so that we couldn't get arraigned. Because they knew if we got arraigned, and I believe this in my heart, if we got arraigned, then the physical, impressions on our body would have been revealed. So it was just, a stark awakening to the ways in which there can be an organized set of decisions that are made by people who have some modicum of authority in that moment of life that completely can derail your life. Because for me, I was charged with assaulting a police officer. I all of a sudden maybe can't take the bar. All of a sudden my entire life is up for grabs, and I didn't do anything. And that's how easy it can happen. And for me, it was a really good and important, and it was unnecessary, yes, but it was an important, valuable lesson I used to develop a level of empathy for, frankly, my brothers and my sisters for whom, there is nobody to pay for them to get a lawyer, or there wasn't the fact that I didn't have had a clean record so I could get out of that situation fairly reasonably easy. But it was something that you never forget. You just never forget. And you never forget going to the courtroom, to the courthouse, and both how casually it can be dismissed. I mean, it wasn't dismissed, it was like a whole variety of things, but then you just see the conveyor belt of bodies moving through that experience. I remember just being on the escalator and watching all these Black men with these lawyers, most of them white lawyers. And I just looked around, I was like, everybody's feeding off this thing right here. The guy shining the shoes is feeding his family off this. The clerk's office is feeding themselves off this. Everybody is feeding themselves off of these bodies, these Black bodies being cycled through this system. And we know it. And we know it.
You talk about your roommate, who just, is it fair to say, never really fully recovered from such a traumatic evening and event?
Yeah, I mean, this is a brilliant human being. Brilliant human being. Humanitarian. He was, he is an amazing human being. But what I can tell you, and I'm not a doctor, and I'm in no way able to diagnose, but I can tell you that his life changed dramatically as a result of that. And it involved mental health crises. And, I always say the last time I connected with him was maybe about 7 or 8 years ago now. And at that point, he was living in in a public assistance facility and an apartment, but it was subsidized by the city. And, he just walked around and he had this suitcase full of religious texts. And he took me around on a walk, and he wanted to show me this ashram that he wanted to build. And he had this whole vision for an ashram he wanted to build. And I just know that there was a trauma that came out of that experience that might have accelerated things. It might have been there was something that was already there, but it definitely created a break for him. And he was never able to get his life moving in a direction that it was moving in prior to that moment. And so you see the impact and the ways in which it reverberates through someone's life. And it reverberates through my life because this is my friend. And I can't ever forget him. I had to separate myself at a certain point because I realized that it was unhealthy for me to be in relationship with somebody who was going through a mental health breakdown and crisis that had been spurred by, in many ways, his interactions or the violence that was beset upon him. Because I got beaten bad, but what happened to him was another level of it. And so yeah, it's really. But I look at my life, and there are a number of friends whose lives are, for better and for worse, littered across the sort of road, the pathway. And for me and for a lot of my, even as being quote unquote middle class, I still felt like I had to run a gauntlet. You still had to run a gauntlet just to get to a place of, okay, I'm not I think everything is okay right now. I don't look in the mirror every time I get in the car and have a anxiety. And so many of my friends just weren't able to run that gauntlet for one reason or another. And that's what to me is so problematic, and that we don't really reckon with is this gauntlet that we require, particularly Black folks, to run in this country in order to prove themselves as American and worthy. And then we still say we don't have enough qualifications for X, Y, and Z. We still don't have enough credentials for X, Y, and Z. When you know what it took for me to get here, just to be in this room, I'm sorry, I can't write those things down, and you can see those that have value in your eyes, but they are valuable and they are important because they have built something up in me. And for me, a lot of it was empathy and understanding, at least an aspiration to understand.
Yeah, and that having these experiences having a compounding impact, right? So I'm going to work one morning and I'm listening to story after story of a Black man shot, killed, beaten, you name it. And then I got to show up for work, right? I have to show up and be whoever I'm supposed to be and push that down or manage it in some way. And to your point, it's like, do you really know what it took for me to get here today, right?
To get here. And I am aware that there are struggles that we all have.
Sure.
That other bodies have other struggles. And so I know there's a centrality that is all specifically, with the Black male body. And I want to always call in that, this is intersectional. And
it is intersectional.
And I'm aware that quite often our attention, our gaze, our focus is on what happens to Black, is how this system operates in relation to Black men. And I want to just name that, I think we've become more aware, at least in the last few years, that it is actually, it may not be as widespread and may not be as sort of regularized, but the intensity of the sort of structural oppression that Black women experience in this country, it requires the same attention. It requires the same focus and awareness, because these are often women who are also mothers.
That's right.
Who are caretakers, who are the main providers, and they still got to show up.
They still got to show
be
up.
Present for your kids, and be present for this people, and be this and that. It's a lot. It's a lot.
So you write the letter to white male friends, and there are some characteristics in the book that I could say, well, that applies to many white females too, right?
Yeah.
There's a thread of white fragility that runs through, but at the end of the book, you really talk about this relationship to patriarchy and paternalism. So why the letter to white male friends? And just talk a little bit about what your thinking was behind this particular audience of folks.
I mean, it's important for people to understand this whole thing is organic. This wasn't like, I didn't sit down and write a letter with the expectation of, okay, a year later, I'm gonna write a book, and then I'm gonna go on tour. That wasn't what it was.
And I'm going to fan.
I'm gonna get a fan, and it's like, oh, no. As I've said this before, like in moments, you in my writing experience and in my writing life, I have learned that you get struck by something in a moment, and your obligation is to allow it to flow through you, and for you to allow it to come out in the ways that it needs to come out. And so for me, it was the case that I was receiving phone calls from my white male friends who were concerned, and they wanted to make sure I was okay. And I said, I am very grateful for that. And I was struggling with the idea that I wanted to ask them the same question. Are you okay? How are you doing? Because this isn't just happening to me. And there's this notion that this is all just happening to us over here. And I think that's part of the sort of the inability to see your own connection to this pain, your own connection to this, and how this is a part of your story too. And that was what I really wanted to get at. And I recognize that as a result of being a member of this, what I call the first post-civil rights generation, these Gen Xers, I say Gen X, nobody got love for Gen X, but Gen Xers, I grew up in an integrated experience where there was almost like it was experimental. my friends now, we talk about, it's like, I think there was a kind of an experiment some places were going through after the 60s, and they were just kind of see what would happen if. And so, but what it meant was that I grew up in having very organic friendships across race from the time I can remember. And they continue to persist throughout my life. So it was not, a 71-year-old man on Facebook the other day said to me, he's like, in relation to the book, he said, I've had white male acquaintances. I've never had white male friends. And I said to him, that's my father's story, actually. And so generationally, there is something significant about me being able to have real intimate relationship, not just with like one or two white people or white men. Actually, they span my life and span my journey. And so therefore I feel an obligation and responsibility to actually talk to you, because let's be clear, white men still hold the vast majority of wealth and power in the society. And that creates, and many people are intimidated by that fact. I am not. And therefore I feel I am called to have a conversation that calls you forward and in to reckon with this thing with me, if I'm truly your friend. And so that's why.
Well, what do you think it is that keeps some white males from believing that systemic racism is real?
So, you're obviously alluding to one of the chapters, one of the essays is actually rooted in this idea of the culture of disbelief.
That's right.
And I define culture of disbelief as one of these, I think one of the ways in which racism continues to harm white people. It's like their inability to believe is it's a real detriment. It's a real harm that's being done to you when you feel the need to question, doubt, and just genuinely disbelieve people, whether it's about our pain, like, whether my physical pain, like, oh, I'm not gonna give you the same medicine because I don't think that I don't think you're really experiencing pain right now.
Feel pain, right. That's documented study.
That's
right?
not real. So like,
Right.
you're saying you're exaggerating, right? So there's the disbelief that it can exist, and there's real life consequences to that. But to answer your question, I think the barrier is who has claimed entitlement over the story of America. And as long as you believe as me as a hyphenated American, as long as you consider my experience a conditional experience or one that is secondary or even tertiary to yours, then there's no way that I can have experiences, insights, expertise, knowledge, whatever else have you, that can be worthy of your serious engagement with. And that's why, and I think that's why in the book I talk about, for me, how I didn't realize it going through, but in reflection, it did not have a Black female teacher from the time I left 6th grade in elementary school, because all my teachers were Black except for one up until 6th grade, until I was my 3rd year in college and I took a Caribbean studies, Caribbean writers class. What does that mean? If I'm not having that experience, my white friends aren't either. So you're never seeing a Black woman in an authority expertise role in your experience. What does that do to you? Does that mean, therefore, when you see a Kamala Harris or you see whoever it is, that you are questioning their credentials or they're willing, or whether they have earned the right to be there? So I think that disbelief is still fundamentally rooted in this notion of one not really being an American, and therefore not necessarily having a claim of right over to this American story or having some right to share in the narrative that we have. And that speaks, I think, to what we're dealing with this critical race theory mumbo, this craziness, is that I think, people just think that there is only one American story and that they get to tell it. And no one else, Native folks don't get to tell their story, Latinx people don't get to tell their story, Black people don't get to tell their story. And that to me that's troubling. And I will say there's still meritocracy mythology, a mythos around meritocracy that I think people cling desperately to in order to legitimize the why behind their lives. And to in any way disrupt that or challenge that, I think it really does strike at something deep for people who've identified themselves as having navigated this whole journey on their own. It's very difficult, I think, for some people to just acknowledge that you've had help. And that's all we're saying sometimes, is that, you maybe have had a little more assistance and support in your journey than other people have. It isn't to say you're not I know it's not to say you're not smart and competent and capable, but it is to say that some people maybe just haven't had the same opportunities you have. And we just need to deal with that. And some people can't hear that. They struggle with that.
I want to talk about critical race theory. It's actually my next question, but I want to follow up to that. You're a lawyer, you know where critical race theory comes from.
Yeah.
So, but back to follow up the other question, that is, you go through a list of questions, self-reflection questions, just, as a matter of just conversational in your approach to engage white males to develop and to think about critical consciousness with regard to race. What are some of those questions? Like, just for the sake of
I think so. I mean, to give it some context, I tell one story, for instance, about the bell curve, Charles Murray's book. And for me, it intersected with my life. And when I was in college is when the book came out, and it sparked a number of protests at Rutgers University, where I was a student. One of those protests led to me being arrested for the first time and having to actually stand trial and go through this. And because we took over a highway, and it was an awakening for me, a lot of ways around my own privilege, there's a lot more I would, articulate around that. But what I ask and challenge people to do is I think about who was engaged in that movement at the time. And I think about how many of my fellow classmates, white class, were just going to class, just moving along. Just that was happening over there. Those Black students over there, if they just did their work, if they just studied harder, then they wouldn't have to. So what I wanted people to do is ask yourself, where were you when this was happening? How were you processing this? The bell curve became a sensation. Everybody was writing about the bell curve. For me as a Black person to have to deal with the fact that my value as a human being was being put on trial, ostensibly, through a pseudoscientific knowledge text that was ultimately a political text. It was designed to extend some political agenda that had been funded by the Bradley Foundation, which was very much behind. And so there's a whole story. So I just want people to stop in these moments and ask themselves, really, where were you? How did you process that moment? Did you reflect on how it might have been influencing the way you were beginning to see the world as you were developing an emerging consciousness of things? My belief is that we have to help people go through a journey. And sometimes we want to start by having a systems conversation. And people ain't ready for the systems conversation. You got to start sometimes with helping folks do a little bit of journey work. And journey work means I need you to help you kind of retrace your own life story so that you can begin to see that maybe there just might have been some gaps. And let's help fill in those gaps. And I'm gonna fill them in by giving you where I was at in that moment so that maybe you can ask yourself where you were. And I believe that's an invitation for learning and for work and for thought processing. Because then when we start to talk about systems, you can be more open potentially to thinking about how systems actually function. So it was strategic, and the intention behind asking folks questions is that this book is a tool. It is not meant to be just read. As I keep saying, I'm not writing a memoir so you can sit back and say, oh, that's terrible, that happened to Dax. That's not what this is, because I didn't actually tell you my whole life story. I told you important pieces that took place inside white dominant structures, so that you could see that same structure that we were sharing, how I was experiencing it. So you can ask yourself how you were experiencing it. And then we can maybe begin to move together with some collective and shared understanding of what the actual experience was.
Yeah, I think it's very powerful, because some people who would pick up your book may not think about themselves or have had to think about themselves as racial beings, but they very much are. And you really give them the tools and create a framework and some groundwork for thinking about themselves as racial people.
Yeah. I mean, we've all been racialized.
We've all been racialized.
We've all been racialized. And if that means you've been racialized in such a way, let's just use them in the material sense, because I think some of the people responded to this even in the letter I wrote. If it's to the extent that you, every time you encounter a Black neighborhood, you feel yourself uncomfortable, or you feel like you want to just move through it, or you assume that the value of the things happening or going on, the property they're in, is diminished or is not the same. Like we see this playing itself out in these really unfortunate stories around like home appraisals. Whenever I read these kind of stories, it just drives me crazy. It drives me crazy to think that if somebody just decides to scrub their house clean of their race, it can actually increase the value of it. That should tell you everything you need. That should be period in the story. What else do we need to talk about at this point? Because really this is because I want to have this, like I do feel like there's a spiritual element and dimension to my call to action for people. Because I feel like there's a missing piece in people's lives, because there's joy in this work too. Like folks think of the DEI work as hard, arduous, and unfun. Actually, and I tell you, about everybody I know that does this work, they are the most joyous people, the most to be around. They have liberation mindset. They want you to be liberated too. And then I encounter people who are resistant to it, and they have this assumption that it is, it has such a negative and weighty belief around it. And I just think that that's a loss for you.
It's a loss because it's soul work. It's soul work.
It's soul work.
It's soul work.
And we're just trying to invite you to be part of the soul work.
That's
and when
right.
you get in touch with yourself, maybe you feel less inclined to need to be in charge or superior or dominate or define yourself in relation to how many people you are. You can define yourself in new ways, and it frees you up too. Because this is working on all of us. I tell that story specifically as it relates to, in DC, I talk about this, one of the chapters in the book is the culture of expropriation. And I'm really kind of grappling with the ways in which gentrification is just a modern manifestation of settler colonialism, because it still operates off many of the same principles of, I'm gonna take your land, I'm gonna take your land. And I'm gonna make it, we're gonna make it sound like we're gonna redevelop it and make it, but it's still ultimately, I'm gonna take your land, right? Yeah. And what I try to tell people is that white people is like, you actually are a tool. You can often be a tool, an unwitting tool in that enterprise. And I use this example that in DC in the early 2000s, the Brookings Institute wrote a report that became sort of the blueprint for how DC decided to go about its process of revitalization, where they presented two basic options. One option was, well, we can decide to attract young, upwardly mobile people who have resources, AKA white people, and there will be some residual resentment of Black people. They write this in the report. They know this is going to be part of the outcome of that. Or we could decide that we're going to, really try to focus on families and really, but you know what, we're not going to bring in enough revenue that way. So we should go. This is what it says to me, is that you are a tool of this project as well. You are seen as someone who can bring commercial value, so that means you are, in many ways, you can find yourself feeling as though that you're a beneficiary, but in many ways, you are, I consider that to be, you're a tool for a larger project that ultimately ends up in the oppression of, and the stripping of communities of color, of power, of resources, and a variety of things. And that's harmful. And I know people don't want to be a part of that, but you got to think consciously about that when you're making those kinds of substantive decisions.
Yeah. And Dax, why is it that Black folks can't buy low and sell high in white neighborhoods?
Why, you said in white neighborhoods or just neighborhoods, period?
And wouldn't they just say neighborhoods in general? I think you say white neighborhoods in the book.
Well, I think what I was trying to use is the comparison. Like,
sure,
we recognize that the buy low high sell happens one way and not the other.
That's right.
So my ability to be a gentrifier is very limited to the extent that I actually don't accelerate value in a community. My presence doesn't send out smoke signals, if you will, signals that, hey, it's cool to come here now, Starbucks. It's cool to come here now, X, Y, and Z box chain, and build up around here because it's these. But I think the why is that there's still a fundamental belief that the presence of too many Black people in a community means that that community is not going to have a good school. It's not, and because many people are making their decisions around schools, they're not going to have the right kind of services. There's not going to have the right kind of X, Y, and Z. And that is an ingrained belief that is still yet to be really fully reckoned with and exhumed and dealt with in this country. So ultimately, we're going to still see these kind of disparities around property. I live in DC. I live on one side of 16th Street. So 16th Street in DC is the dividing line. I know this in Chicago, in the Midwest, there's the dividing line, it's Division Street. Here it's 16th Street. And you see demographically what happens with property value on which side of the 16th Street that you're on. And it just so happens that where I am, I'm on the line itself, but the house that I am living in right now actually was owned previously by two white families, both of whom had small children. And at the point at which those children became school age, they moved west of the park because that's where it is presumed that there are better schools. And it is also, where it is more of a predominantly white community. So there are choices that people are always making that really reflect a sense of what does it mean to live in a community that is even moderately of color, in terms of what kinds of services I'm going to receive, what kind of education my kids will have. And there's a tendency to believe it's going to be inferior.
Yeah. So critical race theory. You know that critical race theory started as critical legal studies and emerged out of the law. You've got the Godfather, Derek Bell. Is that his book behind you? Yeah. Faces at the Bottom of the Well. That's right. Derek Bell, and you got Richard Delgado, Cheryl Harris. For the sake of the people watching, what is critical race theory? And people say that, oh, it's being attacked by the folks on the right. Well, you know, and if you do D&I work, you know that people on the right and the left attack critical race theory because of its tenets and what it really is lifting and the frame that it really supports for lots of industries. So talk a little bit about what critical race theory is, Dax.
So I'm going to do my best to articulate it. You have the letters behind the name. I don't have. You have all that. But I will say this: it is a project that is rooted in legal, scientific, rational, historical analysis that seeks to create a lens through which to understand a variety of phenomenon that have racial implications in our society. Yeah. So it can be the healthcare system, education system, it can be the criminal justice system, it can be a variety, it can be just industry more broadly. I actually look at, you know, you could look at I have this one activity I do sometimes with some folks where I look at the life cycle of Black people in America. It starts from infant mortality rates and maternal mortality rates, and it ends with, you know, with longevity, you know, and every point along the way, you see that there's a disparity. At every point along the way, you see a disparity. So critical race theory seeks to try to create an analysis that we can begin to have a tool through which and by which to begin to both deconstruct and then reconstruct our systems so that they can be more equitable. It is ultimately going to have to talk about and reckon with and engage with elements of history that have not been historically talked about, discussed, or thoroughly engaged with. Its design and intention is not to call out white people or to blame individual white people. It is to talk at the systems level about how things operate. And the data is clear. It is not as if folks are just reaching to sort of create an analysis to explain away things. We can see home ownership. We can see the Black wealth, the wealth divide. We can see healthcare disparities. These are things that are not conjectural. They're not up for debate. Actually, they're rooted in factual and not. So what we struggle with, where folks are trying to really advance the narrative around critical race theory, is that we're trying to advance it as a tool for analysis and then ultimately change. What people struggle with is that, of course, it still runs roughshod against many people's understanding of how societies are formed, how human relations take place, and goes back again to this notion of meritocracy, because it does in some ways challenge the notions of personal responsibility, individual ability to, be the sort of, the grand narrative, if you will, that we have around individual. It does challenge those things. And for many people, that challenges therefore America and the American ideal. It's unfortunate that it's become this politicized thing, but I saw it begin last summer, as a matter of fact. The National Review started the project. I saw the National Review. I saw Reason, a number of these magazines, these sort of, mainstream right-wing magazines, in the headlines at that time were questioning systemic racism. So you got to kind of watch how this thing works. There's a foundation that was beginning to be laid late last summer. It was almost like they gave everybody this summer to have this conversation about race. All right, y'all got this time. We give about 2 months, and then we're going to start to deconstruct this whole thing. So what you saw was articles that were questioning the validity and existence of systemic racism. So they weren't calling it critical race theory at that time. They were using what was the terminology at the moment was systemic racism to poke holes in its validity. And of course, these were very vacuous arguments. They had no legitimacy. They had no real substance behind them, but we know that if you just repeat things again and again, you repeat headlines. And so I then started to see throughout the fall, and then of course Donald Trump gets on the act when he passes the executive order. He signs the executive order banning any kind of quote unquote anti-racist education. And so you start to see that project build. And so it stands to reason that we are in this moment right now where we are encountering people who have not really engaged with it, have no real understanding of what it is up to. And I feel like it's most troubling to see other people, like people of color, be enlisted in and be used as tools in someone else's enterprise, because it is so obvious that that is what's happening when they do that. And I just feel like, oh, my brother, my sister, don't allow them to use you in this way, because that's what they're doing. You are entitled to be a free thinking and have your own, but when you see Fox News is starting to give you the microphone, you got to be careful and understand that there's a reason why they wouldn't be asking you about anything. They wouldn't ask you about anything under the sun. So the fact that they come and ask you this now should give you an indication about something.
You mentioned that critical race theory offers a way to deconstruct, but also reconstruct some ideas and things. And part of that reconstruction is the counter narrative or counter storytelling. And you go out of your way in the book to provide a counter narrative for your experience as a young Black man. Why do you think it's important to do that?
I think, and I worked a long time in the nonprofit sector. And I even write that in many ways, I think even very well-intentioned and, just well-intentioned people more broadly, but specifically white folks, there is a sense that our story there's a real sense of our story being very limited and not really having a complexity around generational experiences with education, with opportunity, with access. I grew up in many ways almost ashamed of my experience as being Black middle class, because in many ways it was not an experience that was celebrated, outside of course of the Cosby Show and a couple of tropes, but it wasn't an experience that was celebrated. And moreover, it was an experience that felt as though it was perceived as being less authentically Black in some way, shape, or form. Now, I'm not of generational me. My dad went to college. That's what I got. My grandparents, my grandfather was an entrepreneur. Like, it wasn't as if we had wealth, but it was education that we had. And that education allowed for me to grow up in a neighborhood that I was surrounded by what I say was thriving Black folks, all of whom had come from the South, who had come from the Caribbean, who had come from all over, who had found themselves in DC and decided to form a community. And I know it happened in other parts of the country as well. I just think it's important that we challenge the notion that the only work to be done and the only way to do work and the only way to perceive the issues and challenges of Black people is through the lens of kind of uplift, and that we have only as a starting point coming from a place of deep, deep struggle, And excuse me, you might hear my daughter. She's having a moment upstairs. It happens, a little baby. So I just think it's important, because I think we need to understand that there are people like me who have important stories to tell as well. And my story might not be a story that talks about how I grew up in poverty and now have somehow made it, because we are very comfortable and we like that story, because quite often that story tells it neatly fits into the American journey and the American story. And I know that story is important. But what happens is other narratives around Black identity feel like they must either fit into that. And I can say for a fact that many of my friends growing up felt like they needed to thug it out. They felt like they needed to, in order to validate themselves, in order to be seen and recognized and accepted, they had to go out and they lived in middle class homes and needed to go sell drugs, because they felt as though that was a way that they would get some validity, because around them, whether it was our music or culture, the things that were being reflected back to them about what is Black did not create space for them to see themselves in a different way. No matter what their parents had tried to create in that little community that we had, we still ultimately had to be exposed to and venture out into a world that didn't reaffirm that sense of identity, that didn't actually give substance to that experience.
Yeah, you talk in the book about the problem of charity culture and these, and this I don't think you use these exact words, but the idea of the great white hope, where you've got white folks wanting to come into communities of color and save Black and brown kids because that's the narrative that fits, American society.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that was probably the hardest chapter to write because I have learned so much, gained so much from my work in the sector. And yet I know that the sector is in a challenging place because you got to raise money and you got to be able to be sustained and sustainable. And therefore you have to have connections to people who have wealth. And quite often that means you don't want to challenge them too much. And the reality is that I came of age inside of a nonprofit, sort of, for lack of a better way of describing, industrial complex that was moving towards a neoliberal sort of framework and understanding of our problems. And when I mean by that is, many of the conversations I found myself in as a leader and as an organizational leader, they situated the problems that existed, they were trying to solve as individual problems that we could create solutions for through individual uplift and celebration of individual young people who, quote unquote, have made it out, without really taking a systems analysis and understanding that, we need to be connected and understand it as a holistic process, and there needs to be a community involved in this change effort. Quite often it became, how do I impose what I have come to believe as a model for change on Black communities or brown communities without really speaking to or engaging in the communities and with the communities? That is shifting now. We are seeing a mobilization of Black and brown leaders who are getting the opportunity to lead organizations, and we hope to see them resourced to the same extent that their white counterparts have been resourced to change things. But the history of the sector, of the way charity culture has been built and designed, is really problematic. I'm really excited about, the money that the funds that the former Mrs. Bezos, has been built, because these are no strings attached gifts. Mm-hmm. There's due diligence done on the front end, and here's your bread. Do your work. Your community, you'll be accountable to the community. You are not accountable to me. And I think too much of the problem is the way that we've designed our structures, these organizational structures, is that we create accountability to a board, and that board tends to be the people who have resources, and the people who tend to have resources tend to be white. And so therefore we have white leaders who are making decisions about projects and institutions and causes and initiatives that ultimately people of color and people who are living through that experience have a more intimate, invested stake in the outcomes for. And we know that is a problem. So we have to change that. We have to change that. That isn't to say we still need people. We need resources. We need people to be, I always say we need people to be a bit more modest about things. There was, if we look again historically, we know that in the 1980s, there was a transformation in the way that our taxing system operated in this country. And as a result of that, that allows a lot more wealth to flow into the hands of individuals rather than into the government, which isn't necessarily a bad thing or a good thing, but it has created a class of people who, called the philanthropic sector, which in many ways drives social change, which is, I think, in many ways a conflict. So I write my journey through it because even as a leader, I found myself falling into that same mode and losing sight of the mission, because I became so beholden to and felt so I needed to be responsive to the people who had the money and not to the cause or the issue, the thing that I was really grappling with. And I just want people to really kind of think about how that model is warping. It warps our sense of what the problems are we're trying to solve, and also who can be and who should be at the table when we're trying to do that solving of problems.
Yeah. I want to make sure I ask this question, this one question before we end tonight, and that is, there's a part in the book where you talk about Mike Pence and the debate between he and Kamala Harris, and I was struck by the discussion, and there's a part, even me watching the debate, I'm like, yeah, he just doesn't get it. But then I think about the documentary 13th. And I remember every time I show 13th to students, I'm struck by, certain white men like Newt Gingrich, political activists, who know exactly what the social construction of race is all about. and they use it for their political and economic advantage, which is why race was admitted in the first place.
Yeah.
So do you really think that some do you really think that some of them just don't get it, or do they know exactly what they're doing?
I mean, I'm not inside Mike Pence's heart, and to use him as an example. More broadly, I think there's some definitely bad faith actors. I call them bad faith actors.
Okay.
These people are acting in bad faith, and and they do know, they're very aware, and they are engaged in like I say, a project that is designed to, sustain and perpetuate white supremacy. That's what they're up to. They will never call it that. They will never find themselves on record stating as much, but that is all their actions point to that. But what I think about in that moment, looking at Mike Pence, and I don't know if it was just the way his body language reacted to, in the way he interacted with Kamala Harris, I looked at him and I actually encountered someone who I actually think doesn't understand. I think he genuinely and substantively has not had the education to help him understand it. And that's what I think is what's so problematic about our country, is that someone could rise to that level of authority in our society and be that, and have that kind of an absence. And to me, that is a fundamental issue that I think is emerging now when I work with CEOs, I work with leaders. And I say, there's no way in the world that a person of color, specifically a Black person, can become a CEO in America without engaging with white America. It just doesn't happen. But a white person can become a leader without actually really engaging with Black America or engaging with race. It has never been required to be a competency until now. And now you have people who want that competency and they want to get it overnight, and they're realizing that it is actually standing in the way of their ability to lead. It is historically not, because their boards don't hold them accountable to diversity metrics. They're not being held accountable to any kind of outcomes related to it. So therefore, why it is not perceived as a competency that is a requirement. But I know for me, there is no way I can move through this world and have, whether it's to get a loan.
That's right.
Whether it's to, I can go to HBCU, I can do that, but at some point, I'm going to have to engage. That is not the experience. And that to me go back to Mike Pence. I'm like, I genuinely look at his life, and that man has not had to have a deep and serious reckoning and or engagement with the experience of Black people in America. And I can see, and I looked at him and I was like, this is someone who's ignorant.
Yeah. You give a lot of advice to white males at the end of the book. What do you think is, just highlight what do you think some of the most important things that you share? Like, for example, maybe you should step down.
Yeah. I mean, I actually had a friend who read that and was like, maybe I should step down, and I'm like, and I felt, damn, I was like, I didn't mean you though. Not you. But I think though that is, if the job description has changed now, if the requirements of the job now are such that you need to be able to have a genuine and real and legitimate conversation, or at least be able to understand what your people are asking for, and you can't do that, then that says you can't do your job. So why are you still in that job? I just don't that to me is really what I get at. I'm like, it's not personal, but it's like, if I am not able to balance the budget, if I'm not able to X, Y, and Z, then then I need to go. And so if now I have an employee base and I work with people who I can't connect with, and who are clearly not able to connect with me, and it's actually affecting our business, because that is actually a reality of like people talk about, there is a business case for it if we want to talk at the crude practical level. To me, says that, you need to look in the mirror and ask, maybe you need to step away. And that's not for everybody, but it's an invitation to ask yourself, could I consider? So that is one piece of, potential advice. And that's probably the hardest, like, whoa, that's deep. But then I also tell stuff to folks. I'm like, I want people to be another thing that gets under my skin, honestly, is that when I talk to people and they say to me things like, yeah, but we want to expand the conversation beyond race. We want to make sure we talk. And I'm like, I never said that the conversation shouldn't be about other things. What came out of my mouth to suggest that when we talk about these issues around diversity, equity, and inclusion, I'm only talking about Black people or talking about race? What I am suggesting is that when we as a country have sought to solve for race, we have been able to solve for a variety of things. So if we look at the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, we look at these amendments, we recognize they are the function of a civil war that was fought on behalf, that was sought to end slavery, and that was instigated by Black folks who were self-liberating. Then we begin to understand we solve for something significant. When we look at the civil rights movement, we look at civil rights legislation of 1964, 65, we solve for something that has now been expanded to encompass a variety of people's experiences and identities. So when we solve for race, we solve for things. So when I hear people like, oh, it's not really that. No, it is that. Let's deal with it, because then we can solve for other things. Because what you know anything about us is we are inclusive people. We are always inclusive people. People always come to us for some grace, and we give grace and we share grace. So I struggle with that idea that focusing on race is limiting. And I think that's a cop-out. I think that's a way for you to get to a conversation you're more comfortable with.
That's right.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for a very, very deep and compassionate conversation between the two of you. We have a couple questions. We only have about 3 minutes left. I want to remind folks. That's okay. I'm going to remind folks that we're going to be doing an after hours that's going to start right after this event at about 8:05. We're going to give Dr. Campbell and Mr. Ross a 5-minute bio break in between. Get a copy of Dax's book. I read it through twice. I keep picking it up and rereading. It's beautiful. Come join that conversation. It's cameras on. You can ask your own questions. It's very lively. Come join after hours. I think you're going to enjoy it very much. So and Dax, let's see if we can get both these questions in.
Do it.
Amanda asks, what resources for elementary or other grade level educators do you recommend for encouraging these conversations and to encourage safety and growth within our classrooms?
Ooh, good. Well, I will start by saying I am probably not the best resources to respond to that question. I would love to get you someone on board who can tell you more about elementary education. What I will say though is the complexity that we assume around these conversations is about us often, and it's actually about our own stuff. And so this notion that we need to simplify, water down, I actually would challenge you that they're probably the majority of texts that are dealing with this are there, if not a snippet or a piece of it can be utilized. But I would just challenge you to think less about the text and more about your own willingness to engage in a conversation that has complexities to it in a way that people, and recognize that young people see it already. Like my child is already being racialized at 2 years old. They see these things and are making their own evaluations already. So you got to trust them a little bit and trust and give them the space to be able to do their own analysis and their own reflection. So that's what I would say. And I will try to get you a list of some other points.
And Dr. Campbell, likely in after hours, my guess is as a principal of a high school and with deep roots with many, many educators, perhaps you can offer a couple examples in after hours. So that's your 6-minute warning.
Is that my warning? Okay. Let me get to Google.
I know.
Oh, come on, Google. You're so funny. Okay, and then Ruben asks, you mentioned the Bradley Foundation during your conversation. This is just one of numerous foundations that gives money to colleges, universities, public programming, and conservative causes that support institutional inequities and American exceptionalism. How do we enact change or dismantle these deeply embedded and extremely well-funded structures? How do we change society when these organizations can continue to bankroll conservative racist agendas? And okay, we got 1 minute. There you go.
I say that we need to we need to shine a light on them more. Right now, they're able to operate in relative secrecy, and we don't trace their practices. So I think that there needs to be a better strategy and project that people on the left who want of revealing, consistently keeping them in the spotlight and not allowing them to sort of hide behind the politicians and the various other causes that they fund. So it's about visibilizing them first and foremost and beginning to put the pieces together to help people see and analyze, how this is how they function and how they work and what they're up to.
Okay, very good. Dr. Campbell, anything you want to say to close out as we reach the 8 o'clock hour?
I just want to say thank you to Dax for such a great conversation. I really appreciate you.
It was beautiful. Thank you so much.
And I want to thank you all for allowing me to come on here. This is a gift, and I'm so grateful. This is an amazing experience. Appreciate it.
We are thrilled to have you as program 57 of 57. Very thrilled to have you.